Good morning. It's been, speaking of birthdays, is the church's birthday. It is also a big birthday weekend in our house as well. My daughter turned 16 this year. Super excited for that. I turned 17 this year too. It was great. Actually, my birthday was yesterday. Turned 43. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Actually, so this is the weirdest thing. My daughter, usually it's like my son that asked for video games for his birthday. My daughter asked for one this year. She wanted a video game and we gave it to her and it came in like this little like SD card, super thin, super tiny. And I thought, oh man, gone are the days of the cartridges. Back when, the real games were played. And friendships were made and broken. But they'll never know the struggle of when it doesn't work, how you fix this problem, right? So it doesn't work, you take out the cartridge and you do what? You blow in it as hard as you can, and you shove it back in, and you maybe bang it a couple times, and it fixes your problem. You reset the whole system just by blowing into it, and maybe a few words and some physical violence. But that whole process growing up was foundational to me in how I really problem solve everything. Every problem just kind of needs a reset. Like, just have you turned it off and turn it back on again? Try that. Have you taken a nap? Just take a nap. Have you tried blowing on it? So that might work. So we're in this series called Staying Grounded, and we're looking at how do we pay attention to what God is doing in the different delays of our life. And one of the delays that you might come across, we've talked about wildernesses, we've talked about detours. Tonight we're going to talk about, or this morning we're going to talk about resets. So what is God doing when your life feels like it is being reset? And I want to introduce you to someone in the Bible who's very famous. I probably don't need to introduce him to you, but his name is Elijah. He's a prophet of God in ancient Israel, and he has had a wild week. If you read 1 Kings chapter 18, you would have thought that you, if you were there, would have witnessed the greatest individual spiritual moment of your life. The man stood alone on a mountaintop. He called down fire from heaven in front of an entire nation and ended a 3-year drought on request. And then he outran a chariot on foot. So he is living the life. But then one chapter later, we find him hiding under a bush in the wilderness, asking God to just let him die. And if that feels like a whiplash to you, it should, because it is. But I don't think the road between those two moments are as strange as it sounds. Because when we go through the text, we're gonna see some stuff. And before we do, I need to talk about one of the things we're gonna come across, which is violence. There's a lot of violence in the Bible, specifically the Old Testament. And if I don't address it now, we might read through this and you might be like, hey, what's up with that? So we're gonna do that. The reason Elijah is running in chapter 19 is because of what he did in chapter 18. Yes, he called down fire from heaven. He exposed 450 prophets for being fake in front of a whole country, and then he had them executed, all of them. And that's disturbing. I know that's disturbing, and you're allowed to be disturbed by that because it doesn't really translate into today's context. And this is how I think we should approach stories like this. We need to uncover the narrative that is happening in the very specific world of the story that's being talked about. And so that narrative is this, that there's this queen, her name is Jezebel, and she is very much known for her cruelty towards her enemies, specifically prophets and prophets of God. And at this point in history, she was systematically hunting down and killing all of the Lord's prophets. 1 Kings 18:4 tells us that she executed them. And she had her Baal cult as a tool of political control and national corruption. So it wasn't just this like, oh my gosh, you believe a different God than me? I'm going to kill you. It wasn't that at all. She was using her influence along with the king to tear down Israel's identity completely. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to be comfortable with this and be like, oh, that makes sense. It definitely doesn't mean that this is the prescribed model for how we get to deal with differences in faith. But we want to put it in context of the whole Bible. And when you look at the New Testament trajectory, from where we were in the Old Testament to the New Testament, all this violence, Jesus comes into the midst of all of this, and he has a message for us to say, hey, put your swords away. So the arc of Scripture is real, to pay attention to the whole story. But the violence in 18 does tell us this, that Elijah was not living in a comfortable, suburban, buffered environment where faith and lifestyle are just easy. He was a prophet in a war zone. He had to be sustained in that. He had life-threatening moments on the daily. He was spiritually exhausted and in conflict for years. And we get to 19, and he has just fallen apart. So the violence paints the picture of the just intense world that Elijah lives in. And I want us to understand that his collapse doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not like this that he just had this collapse of faith. He has been broken. And I think we can relate to that. So let's get into it. I'm going to read through it, and then we'll go kind of through some of the sections. This is 1 Kings 19. It says, Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of them. And Elijah was afraid, and he ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom brush, he sat down under it, and he prayed that he might die. He said, Lord, I have had enough. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. Then he lay down under the bush, and he fell asleep. All at once, an angel touched him and said, Get up and eat. He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over some hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and he drank it, and then he lied down again. And then the angel came back a second time and touched him and said, Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. So he got up and he ate and he drank. And strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God, where he went into a cave and he spent the night. So he slept again. And the Lord came to him and said, What are you doing here, Elijah? And he replied, I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant. They've torn down your altars, put your prophets to death with the sword, and I am the only one left. And now they're trying to kill me too. And the Lord said, Go out, stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, and the Lord is about to pass by. And then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire was a gentle whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face, and he went out, and he stood on the mouth of the cave. And then the voice said to him, What are you doing here, Elijah? And he replied, I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, put your prophets to death by the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. And then the Lord said to him, Go back the way you came and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael, king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel. And anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel to succeed you as a prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael. Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal and whose mouths have not kissed him. So we're going to walk through this a little bit. This first part, when Ahab and told Jezebel everything that Elijah had done, including how he had killed all the prophets with his sword, they sent a message to Elijah. May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of them. This is a common oath that a lot of people take in a lot of almost like if I'm not broken because of this, it's because I want to see you broken. I am willing to have the worst thing happen to me so that the worst thing can happen to you. And so this is the vibe. And when Elisha gets this message, he is afraid and he runs for his life. After everything Elijah had done for God, this is an interesting choice. There was a drought that he ended. He had ravens come feed him in the morning. He raised a widow's son from the dead. He called fire down from heaven. He exposed 450 prophets. And one message from the queen sent him running. And you might look at that and go, well, that means he didn't have as much faith as we thought he did. But if you're actually seeing this story, I think there's something much more realistic about life in this than just a faith failure. Elijah was tired. Not the sleepy tired, like I need a vacation tired, the kind of tired that gets into your bones. The kind of tired where you've been so fully present, so fully poured out, so fully on for so long that the moment comes when you don't have any more energy to fight, that your body makes a decision before your heart and your head can catch up. There's just been this sustained intensity, and it has cost him. And that's where Elijah was. It's this gap of lots of outward faith, but internally he is dry and weary and struggling. Elijah's resume was probably one of the greatest ones you'll read in all of the Bible, but none of that kept him immune from freaking out over a very real threat after years of war. There was a gap, and the gap doesn't care how impressive your faith is. This is actually worth settling into for a minute, because a lot of us carry our spiritual resumes like they're supposed to be protective somehow. Like, I've been saved for 20 years. I shouldn't be struggling with this. Or I teach Sunday school, or I lead a small group, or I've been in ministry for a decade. Why do I feel like I'm falling apart? But the length of your resume doesn't determine how full your tank is on the inside. Elijah had called down fire from heaven, and he still couldn't handle a threatening message without cracking. Which tells me that this isn't a story about weak faith. This is a story about what it means to be human when everything story of being a human being who has been going through everything for such a very long time. The most put together person in the room can often be carrying the heaviest thing. And so when Elijah runs in the story, we're not going to judge him. We're going to watch, because his feet take us to somewhere where God is already waiting for him, and he's about to reset him for something new. So he leaves his servant in Beersheba, the southernmost edge of civilization. He goes a day's journey into the desert alone. He sits down under a broom tree. I have no idea what that is. I don't think brooms are involved. And he prayed that he might die. He says, "I've had enough, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." And then he laid down and he fell asleep. And I want to stop here and name what is actually in the text, because the church, I think, has not always been so great at this. Elijah sounds suicidal. He's isolated himself from the one person that he was with. He has gone so far from human contact that he could get into the desert, and he's lying under a tree, and he's asking God to end his life. This isn't a metaphor. This isn't hyperbole. This is a man who has been through serious distress. And this story is in the Bible. It's one of the greatest prophets who ever lived. It's happening to him, and that matters. Because if our beliefs about mental health have no room for moments like this, then I think we have a problem. Dr. Thema Bryant, who's a psychologist, a theologian, and a past president of the APA, she says that the church has sometimes done profound harm to people by treating mental health struggles as evidence of spiritual failure. It's not one and the same. And she might rewrite, because what God does do when Elijah hits this moment, he doesn't rebuke him. He doesn't say, "Man, Elijah, after everything I've done for you, you're just going to lay down and you're going to quit." No, he brings an angel. An angel shows up, touches him on the shoulder, and says, "Get up and eat." That's it. The whole divine interaction is, here, have a snack. Have something to eat. And here's what I think this tells us about who God is. He's not primarily concerned with your performance. He's interested in you, the whole person, the body that hasn't slept, the nervous system that's been running on adrenaline and terror, the person who hasn't eaten. God looked at Elijah. He was exhausted. He was suicidal. He was alone in the desert. And the first thing he addressed about him was his own body. God is looking at your whole system going, you need to take care of yourself. And I want to help. And I don't want us to miss this. The angel comes twice. Elijah eats a first time and a second time, and he drinks. He takes another nap. The angel comes back because apparently he had not been done resting. And the second time the angel comes, he says, "Okay, get up and eat. The journey is too great for you." The angel acknowledges the road ahead. He acknowledges that this is going to be a difficult thing. But I could stand and hear sometimes. I could stand to hear that sometimes, because God looks at what we carry and he acknowledges how heavy it is. He says, you need maybe some more time. You need one more night to think about this. You need a little bit more to process what's going on. To have a God that cares and understands that is encouraging. And so Elijah gets up from the second visit, and he walks 40 days and 40 nights into Horeb, into the mountain of God. And you're seeing that Elijah is on this journey of resetting him, of being reset. He's going somewhere, even if he doesn't know where this is going to end. He's now cared for a little bit, and he's headed into a new direction. And so Elijah gets to Horeb, and he finds a cave, and he spends the night, and the word of the Lord comes to him, and he says, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And I want to spend some time on this question because I think we're prone to read into this. This isn't like God saying, "Hey, explain yourself, Elijah." Don't read it that way. He knows where Elijah is. He's just been feeding him for 40 days in the desert. The question isn't about location. The question is an invitation of, "Hey, tell me what happened. Tell me what you're doing, how you're doing in all of this." The question is asking Elijah to be honest about his own condition. And so Elijah answers, "Look, I've been very zealous for you, the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too." And one thing stands out to me, that he believes he's the last one. He's absolutely convinced that the entire enterprise of God's people and their mission has collapsed, and it's just down to him, and they're coming for him next. That is a lot to be carrying. And God doesn't argue with him. God doesn't correct him. God doesn't say, and God says, "Go stand on the mountain." And then, this is really cool, the next part of the text is probably genuinely stunning if you're there. The whole barrel of like divine power shows up. Wind as strong that it tears mountains apart and shatters rocks. An earthquake, fire. Like if you had a checklist of how would God dramatically show up in the Bible, it would be all of these things. But the text says that the Lord wasn't in the wind, wasn't in the earthquake, wasn't in the fire. Then most English translations say what comes next is a still small voice or a gentle whisper. But the Hebrew's kind of stranger than that. The literal sense is closer to the sound of thin silence. It's a sound that's barely a sound. The thinnest possible voice, almost nothing. And that's where God is. So why does this matter? This teaches us something about how God resets us. If Elijah's whole ministry had been about the dramatic, about fire from heaven and drought on command, public confrontation, spectacular, undeniable, everybody saw it in public power, and God just demonstrated that he can do all that with the wind and the earthquake and the fire, but then he chooses to step outside of that and use a very, 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 very thin, small voice. It says, "This is how I want to talk to you." A.W. Tozer wrote that the voice of God is not in competition with the noise of the world. It simply waits. And I think that's exactly what's happening in this moment. God is resetting Elijah towards a different kind of relationship, one that doesn't only work when the circumstances are dramatic and fancy and, oh my gosh, look at that. It's different. Because if we're honest with this question, it raises us for today is if you can only feel God in the earthquake, what happens when your life goes quiet? What happens when you don't get the sign that you're looking for? What happens when the worship service just doesn't hit the way that it used to, or when your prayer life feels dry, or when you're sitting in church on your last strand of faith going, "This isn't making sense to me," and it's all breaking down? What if in that quiet, it is not God's absence, but it's actually his presence in a very, very concentrated form resetting you? Some of us have trained ourselves to only recognize God in the spectacular, but maybe God is over there week after week in the thin silence, in a conversation with a friend, in a verse that catches you off guard, or in the very fact that you just woke up this morning with a little bit more energy to fight. And we keep looking past those moments because we feel like it takes the spectacle or the dopamine hit to feel like we're connected to God. I'm not saying those moments aren't real, they are, but if dramatic is the only thing that you're tuned into, you're going to miss a lot of the other stuff that God is doing. So after the thin silence, God asked this question again. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah gives the exact same answer that he gave the first time, word for word. "I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too." And this is great. The second time, same question, same answer. If you've ever been a parent and done that to your kids, you're like, wrong answer. You should have learned by now. And I don't think Elijah has grasped things yet. He stood on the mountain. He's experienced the wind and the earthquake and the fire. He's heard the thin silence. He's had the full spectrum. And he's assessed his situation, and nothing has changed for him. This is how real recovery works. It's not linear. It's not always going on the up and up. It doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It's not like an episode of Full House where Uncle Jesse solves all of your problems after 30 minutes. You don't have a spiritual encounter and wake up and go, oh, everything's good now. Elijah heard from God and was still saying the exact same things that he had been saying before. And this is what God does with that. He doesn't correct Elijah's emotional state before he gives them something to do. He doesn't say, well, I'll just wait here until you're ready, or you can come out when you're done thinking about that. Right? He gives them 3 names. Hey, I want you to go find Hazael, Jehu, and Elisha. And he says, this is your next move. I need you to go anoint them. This is your next step. And so God resets him by giving him a purpose, something that he can do when he feels useless and when he feels alone. And I think that matters for us to pay attention to, because a lot of us are waiting to feel better, I think, before we take our next step. We're waiting to feel less afraid or less exhausted or less unsure, because we want to say yes to God, but only when we're like, oh, only if I'm really sure about this. And God apparently does not need to wait for you to feel ready. He will meet you in a cave. He might even meet you at a rave or in a boat or with a goat, or when you're sad or when you're mad. He'll meet you right here or there. He will meet you anywhere. Put that on a t-shirt. And he gives you an assignment anyways. And when God says something then God says something that I think is the emotional center of this entire passage. After everything, after the tree and the bread and the 40 days and the wind and the earthquake and the fire and the thin voice. And he says, what are you doing here? God says this, I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal and whose mouths have not kissed him. This means there's 7,000 people back there, Elijah. You're not alone. You are not the only one. There are 7,000 people. Elijah had been walking around with the absolute conviction that he was the last one, the only one left who still cared for anything, willing to stand up publicly and fight. And God says, no, there's 7,000 more people in this country that have not yet bowed to Baal. And I don't know if he just didn't know they existed. He might have. In the chapter before, he was told that at least 100 of them are hiding in caves. But I think the deeper reason Elijah didn't know about the 7,000 is that he just arrived at this conclusion on his own while he was isolated. He had catastrophized the whole event, the whole situation. He made an assessment of the entire state of God's people, that he was alone under a tree in a desert. And we know that isolated assessments are almost always wrong. When we're burned out, when we're in a spiral, when we're in our own cave of our head, our brain tells us things like that feel absolutely true. It tells us that we're the only one who's ever felt this way. That's not true. It tells us that the situation is more dire than it is. That's not true. It tells us that everyone else has it together and we're the ones that are wrong. That's not true. It tells us that we are stronger, that if we were stronger, smarter, faithful, more disciplined, then we wouldn't be here in this moment. That's not true. This is why community is not optional for your mental and your spiritual health. And I don't mean that you just need to get into a program or a small group because the church tells you to, although we do because we believe in it. It's actual lived experiences of being known by people who tell the truth to you about yourself. People who can say to you things like, you're not the last one. I've been where you are, or I'm still here. And this is the story of God doing a reset. It's about a man who burned bright and then burned out. He ran away. He asked God to let him die. He was fed by an angel. He walked 40 days. He heard God in the silence thinner than a whisper. He received the same question twice, gave the same answer twice, and he was still useful. So this isn't a cautionary tale about what happens to followers of God who lose their nerve. It's a story of what God does with people who have nothing left to give. And I think that some of us have come in here today, or at least know someone who's carrying the weight of a season that has cost you more than you're letting on. You're still going through the motions. You're here, you showed up, but something in you ran away a long time ago, and you're not sure how you're going to get it back. Maybe you're not even sure you want it back anymore. And I want to tell you that God's first move is not to evaluate you in this moment. His first move is to show up and ask, hey, tell me what's going on. Where are you actually right now? And then he'll feed you. and he'll let you rest. And he'll walk a long road with you to a new purpose. He'll show you something about himself and yourself that maybe you haven't seen before. He'll tell you the truth about people in your life who are still in your life fighting alongside of you, even when you can't see them. Elijah's story is great because he gets these things. He continues on. He anoints 3 world changers. Elisha, the guy that comes after him, goes on to do twice as many miracles as Elijah ever did. And that only happens because of God resetting Elijah in that moment. And that's what a reset can look like when you stay grounded in what God is doing. So I have a couple questions for you. The first is for your head. Where do you expect to find God showing up? And is it possible that he's showing up somewhere else? 2, for your heart, what are you carrying right now? Not what you tell people you're carrying, what are you actually carrying? And 3, for your hands, who are your 7,000? Who can you reach out to for support this week?